Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the new album from Biosphere, Shortwave Memories. Alright, Biosphere, Gear Jansen, I think we are no stranger to this legendary ambient composer on this channel. I've already thoroughly discussed all his previous studio albums and done dedicated videos on each one, including an odds and ends and a worst to best ranking. Link to the relevant playlist is in the description. This guy has put out so many great ambient albums over several decades, ranging very heavily in style and approach, that I don't think I really need to go into. From the early 90s through the 2000s, he was super consistent, although after his 2011 album Plants, his catalog did get a fair bit spottier as he put out a few experiments that maybe didn't go over as well or didn't result in as interesting ideas. The only other album he put out since then that, really strongly resonated with me was the Senja recordings in 2019, which, to be fair, was just as great as the stuff in his prime, albeit in its own unique way. But most of his other stuff in this era has stayed around decent to okay territory, including his last album from last year, Angel's Flight. It was a perfectly alright blend of melted samples from old Beethoven recordings that didn't really leave that strong an impression on me one way or the other, and I haven't come back to since putting up my video. A lot of Biosphere's last several albums have been various minimalistic manipulations of field recordings or other samples like that, and it's all tended towards extremely low-key and airy territory, including Senja recordings. But this latest album here, Shortwave Memories, appears to be a direct move away from that style, and perhaps more of a return to his roots in kind of a more ambient techno-leaning style, I guess. This album is made entirely out of synths, his first to be done in that style since Plants. And while I don't think this album is quite as good as that one, it's really freaking solid and feels like another late period highlight for him. Plants was a little better produced than this album, and its nuclear energy themed concept could make its similarly low-key ambient techno flavored compositions feel higher stakes, where this album has no such concept and feels much lower stakes. I wouldn't be surprised if some people were to call it dry and boring, but I mean, low-key and minimalistic is kinda just what Gear Jansen does, and if that's your biggest complaint, then you must be new here. But it's also worth noting that I think Shortwave Memories might also be even more consistent than Plants, as well as much better flowing. There's no single moment on here as amazing as Genkai 1, but every single track on here is a varying shade of really good and had the potential to be one of my favorites at some point. I had a particularly hard time deciding on a least favorite on this one. The whole album is directly built to flow together as if part of the same piece. It's all a tight continuous mix, but you can still generally tell where each track begins and ends. My first listen of this thing was off the Bandcamp page with buffering pauses in between each track, and getting to hear exactly how each of these tracks directly transitions into the next just had me like, oh, that was really cool. Albums like these are why I love continuous mixes. Going through individual tracks, the opening cut, Tanz, didn't feel like it had much emotional depth or was attention-grabbing as start as it could have been, but I did quite like the swinging, whooshing drum machine rhythms and icy pads it explored. It did at least generally set the tone and effectively pull me in. Though the point at which I knew I was in for something more special was Interval Signal. At first it just runs through some minimal pads left over from the opener and puts a few plinky acid-like melodies on top that remind me a bit of a beeping radar or something. And at the halfway point of the track, these really satisfying and deep rounded bass lines come in, and the track picks up more energy with a light drum machine beat, and I was like, hell yeah, this is some great minimal synth. And it transitions well in the next two cuts, which are even better. Night Shift lives up to its title with its mix of mechanical tapping beats and dark brooding melodies. It really brings that nocturnal vibe together and keeps me invested in spite of not progressing much over 6 minutes. Though at the end there's a switch into these plinking triplet arpeggios, and it creates the perfect lead up for following track Formanta to get started, with its even deeper and darker bass synths and more unstable triplet rhythms. Eventually exploring some really thin buzzing pads, but still focusing most of its effort on the core groove out of the bass and percussion. The groove on here is quite possibly the best of them all, and the transition between these two tracks was probably the most cleverly executed as well. Next we get the title track, which I went back and forth with a lot. It's technically the one I have marked as my least favorite, since some of the synth pads explored here are a bit on the thin and unpleasant side. It feels like a layer of smog is very subtly suffocating the whole track. But anytime I actually get to it, I'm still like, I really like this one though. Like, there's a decent amount of progression from slightly thicker beats to plinky melodies and clunkier bass textures, and the melodies themselves are quite good and satisfying. This may not be one of my favorites on here, but it is still a really solid track. But this cut really got showed up by the following one, Infinium, which stretches over 8 minutes, carries over some of the pads from the title track, and takes them into even more compelling ideas. At first it just layers a few isolated piano-like chords, then it introduces all these wobbling bass lines that seem to have a much faster pulse, until it's revealed about 3 minutes in that the meter you felt isn't the one you think it is. It's such a cool effect, and both the faster and slower grooves created out of this sort of counterpoint are really strong for what they are. I think this was probably my single favorite cut in the bunch. Shroothy 12 does tend to feel more like an interlude than anything else and doesn't flow as seamlessly out of the previous cut as maybe some other transitions do, but I couldn't bring myself to mark it as a least favorite, as I really like the sound of all those disparate plinky melodies that blip all over the place and create a really intriguing, mysterious atmosphere. And then there's the 14-minute closer, Transfigured Express, which may not have one of the smoother transitions either. Some of those initial synth progressions it introduces on top of the previous cut feel like they're maybe not quite in the right key, but those arpeggios from the last track keep running on for a good 2 minutes, even as stronger drum machines come in. And even if it doesn't seem to work at first, it kinda ends up fitting better as it goes along. I don't know. Anyway, even if this 14-minute cut doesn't have a lot to it, it does manage to keep me invested the whole way through as it slowly evolves over time. The plinking arpeggios at first just slowly melt into like these airy pads that resemble orchestral string sections out of like a suspense movie soundtrack, and then just slowly coming back in at the very end, and all going over this marching drum machine beat that just... all of it is just like perfectly paced to keep my attention. It's a really strong finish. Now, as a complete whole, I will admit that if you compare Shortwave Memories to a lot of his peak period work, it doesn't quite measure up. When I first heard this, I was like, oh, this has got to be one of his best ones, maybe even near the top of my ranking. It's not as good as Endplant, it's not as good as This Engine Recordings, maybe, no, it's not better than Microgravity. What's next? Oh, Cirque. I kind of forgot how many great albums this guy has. If I were to place it in the ranking, though, that's where it'd go. Right below Cirque and Microgravity, which are kind of interchangeable, but right above Potashnik. Potashnik is a mixed bag with 4 great tracks and 8 more that range from pretty good to eh. But it is still a good album, and my least favorite Biosphere album that I still consider good enough to keep on my iPod in its full entirety. Shortwave Memories doesn't have high points as high as that one, but every single one of these cuts feels much more strongly interconnected, and I enjoy all 8 of them roughly the same amount. The album is a lot better crafted as a complete whole, not to mention I think this album feels a lot more timeless than Potashnik. That album is very obviously early 90s in the synth textures and rhythms it explores, but this one feels like it could have reasonably came out as early as like the late 70s, or any time since. Gives me similar feelings to that Hannah Peel album from last year in that way, and even if the production can be maybe a bit on the dry side and this isn't as exciting a listen, its pleasures were executed in an even more subtle and stripped-back way in true Gear Jensen fashion. I don't know how much I'm going to get out of this, like, replay value-wise in the coming months, but I did have fun with this every time I put it on. And if you're in the mood for some minimal synth compositions, it's definitely worth picking up and giving a spin. Definitely one of his better projects of the last decade or so. And I can give this a 7.5 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.